Great Smoky Mountains, Tennessee, February 21st, 1878. There are promises made in darkness, promises no one witnesses except the mountains and the wind. This is the story of one such promise, a promise made on a night when the temperature dropped to 10 below zero in a narrow canyon called Raven's Gap, where the Cherokee people knew it as Navwati Ugidali, the place where spirits judge. And the man who kept that promise would face hell itself to honor it. The wind rolled down from Gregory Ball that night, sharp and merciless, cutting through the high country without slowing. The kind of cold that finds every gap in your clothes, every weakness in your resolve. Snow had been falling since dusk, laying a fresh blanket over the old, until the world became nothing but white silence and black shadow. 2 miles east of a small cabin in Katie's Cove, in a canyon the locals avoided after dark, a woman hung from an ancient oak tree. Not hung by the neck, no. They wanted her to suffer longer than that. Her wrists were bound high above her head with rough hemp rope, the kind that cut deep and drew blood. Her ankles were tied tight together with twisted wire, forcing her to stand on tiptoe or hang from screaming shoulders. The cotton dress she wore, once earth-colored but now stained with dirt and blood, was torn at the shoulder and the wind found every opening. She had been there for 2.5 hours. Kiona was 25 years old. Apache by birth, Cherokee by marriage of her late mother to the tribe. Daughter of Neshoba, a warrior turned blacksmith who had chosen peace over war. And tonight she had been left to die, not by strangers or enemies, but by family. Her breath came in short, controlled bursts, each one creating a small cloud in the freezing air. She had stopped shivering an hour ago, which she knew was a bad sign. The cold was winning, but she had made a decision when they tied her here. She would not cry. She would not beg. If this was how she died, she would face it standing. So she sang, an old Apache song her father had taught her when she was 8 years old. A song about the bear and the moon and the water that never stops flowing. Her voice was weak, barely above a whisper, but it was hers. It was defiance. It was proof she still breathed. And 400 yards to the south, moving through the dark pines with a practiced silence, it was also the sound that saved her life. Caleb Thorne was 31 years old, though the hard lines around his eyes made him look older. 6'2", broad through the shoulders from years of splitting wood and hauling game. His beard was thick and dark, grown long because shaving required caring about appearances, and he had stopped caring about such things 5 years ago. He wore a buffalo hide coat with the fur turned in, worn boots that had seen 1,000 miles, and he carried a Winchester rifle like it was an extension of his arm. He lived alone in a cabin he had built with his own hands in Thorns Hollow, a sheltered spot in Cades Cove where the mountains protected him from wind and the world. He had lived there since 1873, since the day his wife Sarah died, since the day he put a bullet in the chest of the cavalry captain who ordered her death. Tonight, February 21st, he had left his cabin to check his trap line along Abrams Creek before the snow got too deep. He was not looking for company. He never looked for company anymore. But as he moved through the trees, testing his footing in the fresh powder, he heard something that made him stop cold. Wolves, not the distant howling of a pack on the hunt. This was different, closer, concentrated. 4, maybe 5 voices overlapping, calling to each other with a focused intensity that spoke of prey cornered and waiting to be taken. Caleb knew wolves. He had tracked them, trapped them, and on 2 occasions, been tracked by them. Wolves on the hunt scattered, ranging wide, communicating across miles. Wolves gathered tight like this meant one thing. They had something pinned down and were working up the courage to close in. He stood in the snow for a long moment, breath steaming, rifle cold against his gloved hands. He could turn back, return to his cabin, stoke his fire, drink his whiskey, and let whatever was happening in Raven's Gap happen without him. That had been his way for 5 years. Do not get involved. Do not care. Caring got people killed. But then he heard something else beneath the wolf calls. Faint, almost lost in the wind. A human voice, singing. Caleb closed his eyes. In his mind, he saw Sarah's face. Saw her smiling at him the morning they left Fort Apache. saw her packing medical supplies to help Apache children she had never met, saw her lying in the dirt with a bullet hole in her chest, placed there by a soldier who mistook her for a target because she wore buckskin. He opened his eyes. The wolves were still calling. The singing continued, thin but unbroken. Caleb adjusted his grip on the Winchester, checked the rounds in the chamber out of habit, and turned north toward Raven's Gap. Some things, he thought, you cannot walk away from. Not twice, Wunk. The canyon came into view 15 minutes later. Raven's Gap was a narrow cut between two stone ridges, barely 50 feet across at its widest point, with rock walls climbing 100 feet on either side. The Cherokee considered it a sacred place, and also a cursed one, a place where spirits tested the worthy and judged the guilty. Most people avoided it, especially at night, but tonight it was occupied. Caleb dropped to one knee behind a snow-covered boulder at the canyon's southern entrance. He brought the rifle up slowly, scanning the scene before him with the careful attention of a man who had scouted for the cavalry and learned that hasty movements got you killed. 100 yards ahead, in the center of the gap, stood the oak tree, ancient and massive, its bare branches reaching up like skeletal fingers toward the cloud-covered moon. And tied to that tree, barely visible in the dim light, was a human figure. Closer, much closer, 3 wolves paced in the snow. Gray and brown mountain wolves, each one weighing 120 pounds of muscle and teeth. They moved in slow arcs, testing the edges of their courage, getting closer with each pass. And from the figure at the tree, impossibly, came that thin thread of song. Caleb's jaw tightened. The woman was not screaming, not begging, not even silent in terror. She was singing, keeping the wolves at bay with her voice, with the one weapon she had left. He had seen a lot of courage in his life. Soldiers charging into gunfire, scouts walking into hostile camps with nothing but a white flag. But this was something different. This was a woman tied to a tree in 10 below zero weather. Wolves circling, death certain, and she was singing. He made his decision in the space of 2 heartbeats. Caleb rose from behind the boulder and stepped into the open. The wolves saw him immediately, their heads snapping toward this new presence. He raised the Winchester to his shoulder, sighted on the ground 3 feet in front of the nearest wolf, and fired. The crack of the rifle echoed off the canyon walls like thunder. The bullet kicked up a spray of snow and frozen dirt. The wolves scattered, bounding back 20 yards, heads low and uncertain. Caleb worked the lever action, chambering another round, and fired again, this time over the head of the second wolf. The animal yelped and bolted, and the others followed, disappearing into the brush at the canyon's edge. He did not wait to see if they would regroup. He ran. His boots pounded through the snow, each step sinking 6 inches, his breath coming hard in the thin, cold air. 80 yards, 60, 40. As he closed the distance, he could see her more clearly now, dark hair hanging loose past her shoulders, skin pale from cold, arms stretched overhead in a position that would have been agony after the first 10 minutes. She was watching him approach, her eyes sharp and evaluating, trying to determine if he was rescue or a different kind of threat. Caleb skidded to a stop 5 feet from the tree, rifle still in one hand. Up close, he could see the rope burns on her wrists, raw and bleeding. Could see her lips, blue-tinged and trembling. Could see the intelligence in her eyes as she studied him with the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust easily. He slung the rifle over his shoulder and drew his knife, a 10-inch Bowie blade he kept sharp enough to shave with. "I am going to cut you down," he said, keeping his voice low and steady. "Do not be afraid." "I am not afraid of wolves," she replied, her voice hoarse but firm. "I am afraid of the men who left me here." Caleb paused, knife raised, and met her eyes. There was no pleading in them, no relief at his arrival, just a hard, calculating assessment. She was not sure yet if he was better than the alternative. Fair enough, he thought. He stepped close enough to smell the wood smoke and blow it on her, and slipped the blade under the rope binding her wrists. The hemp was thick, wet with melted snow, and he had to saw for several seconds before the fibers parted. When they did, the tension released all at once and her arms dropped like dead weight. Her knees buckled, her body starting to fold. Caleb caught her before she hit the ground, one arm around her waist, taking her weight. She was light, too light, and burning hot despite the cold air. He could feel the fever heat of her skin through her torn dress. She pushed against his chest immediately, trying to create distance even though her legs would not support her. Easy, Caleb said, releasing her as soon as she had her balance. I am not going to hurt you. He crouched and cut the wire around her ankles, the thin metal parting easier than the rope had. When he straightened, she was swaying on her feet, arms wrapped around herself, teeth chattering so hard he could hear them. Caleb shrugged out of his buffalo coat, the cold hitting him immediately, and draped it over her shoulders. It was too big, hanging down past her knees, but it was warm from his body heat. She pulled it tight around herself without a word. My cabin is 2 miles southwest of here, he said. Can you walk? She took one step and her right leg gave out. She caught herself on the tree, jaw set in frustration. I can, she insisted. Maybe, Caleb agreed, but not 2 miles in the snow, not in your condition. He turned his back to her and crouched slightly. I will carry you. It is not charity, it is practical. For a long moment she did not move. He could feel her eyes on his back, weighing options, calculating risks. Finally she spoke. If you mean to harm me, you will regret it. Noted, Caleb said. Now get on before we both freeze. She climbed onto his back, her movements stiff and pained. He hooked his arms under her knees, adjusted her weight, and stood. She was maybe 120 pounds, less than a deer carcass, and after 5 years of living alone in the mountains, his strength was not an issue. What is your name? He asked as he started walking, retracing his path through the snow. Kiona. I am Caleb. Caleb Thorne. Silence for a dozen paces, then quietly. Who did this to you, Kiona? Another silence, longer this time. When she finally answered, her voice was flat, drained of emotion. Family. Caleb did not ask anything else after that. He knew that tone, knew the weight of betrayal when it came from people who should have protected you. He had his own ghosts along those lines. So he walked in silence, carrying her through the frozen forest, while the wind picked up and the wolves called from somewhere behind them, still hunting, still hungry. It took 30 minutes to reach the cabin. Caleb's shoulders were burning by the time Thorne's Hollow came into view, but he did not slow down. The small structure sat nestled against a rock face on the north side, with the stone wall providing shelter from the worst of the winter winds. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, a thin gray line against the night sky. He had banked the fire before leaving, and it would still have coals enough to build up again. He pushed the door open with his shoulder and carried Kiona inside, setting her down gently on the edge of his bed. The only bed, a simple wooden frame with a corn husk mattress and wool blankets that had seen better days. She sat there still wrapped in his coat and looked around the cabin with the same careful attention she had given him. It was not much to see. One room 20 feet by 15, the bed along the far wall, a small table with 2 chairs, shelves holding a few jars of beans, coffee, salt, a pot hanging over the fireplace. Everything neat, clean, organized. The home of a man who had nothing else to do but keep things in order. On the wall above the table, a single photograph in a simple frame. A woman with dark hair and kind eyes, smiling at something outside the image. Caleb saw Kiona's gaze linger on the photograph for a moment before moving on. She did not ask. He did not explain. He crossed to the fireplace and began building up the fire, adding 3 split logs to the glowing coals, working the bellows until flames licked up around the new wood. Heat began to push back against the cold immediately. From the water barrel, he filled a tin cup and brought it to her, too. She took it with both hands, raised it to her lips, and drank. Too fast. Water spilled down her chin and she coughed. Slow, Caleb said, keeping his voice gentle. Cold water too fast will make you sick. She nodded and drank again, slower this time, her eyes never leaving him. Caleb retrieved a bottle of whiskey and a clean cloth from a shelf. He sat in one of the chairs, pulling it close to the bed. This is going to hurt, he said, pouring whiskey onto the cloth. Kiona extended her hands without being asked. The rope burns on her wrists were worse than he had thought. Deep gouges where the hemp had cut through skin, edges already red and swollen. He pressed the whiskey-soaked cloth against the first wound. Her jaw clenched, her breath hissed through her teeth, but she did not pull away, did not cry out. Caleb worked methodically, cleaning both wrists, then wrapping them with strips of clean cotton. His movements were practiced, efficient. He had done this before for himself and others, in the years when he scouted for the cavalry and later when he lived alone and accidents happened far from doctors. When he finished, she flexed her fingers experimentally, testing the bandages. "You will want to change the dressing tomorrow," he said, standing, "and keep them clean." He moved to the trunk in the corner and opened it, pulling out a thick wool shirt, blue, faded from washing, too large for her, but warm. He set it on the bed beside him. "You need to change. That dress is wet, and you will catch pneumonia if you stay in it." He paused, then added, "There is a back door behind the curtain there. I will go outside while you change. Knock when you are ready." Kiona looked at him for a long moment, studying his face, looking for something. Lies, maybe, or intentions. Whatever she saw or did not see made her nod. "Thank you, Caleb." He grabbed his coat from where she had set it aside, pulled it on, and stepped out into the cold. The door closed behind him with a soft thud. He stood in the snow, hands in his pockets, breath steaming, and looked up at the stars beginning to appear through breaks in the clouds. "Sarah," he whispered to the night, "I did not save you, but maybe I can save someone else." The wind offered no answer. It never did. 5 minutes later, a knock came from inside. Caleb opened the door and stepped back into warmth. Kiona had changed into the wool shirt, which hung on her like a dress, the sleeves extending past her hands. Her torn dress lay folded on the floor. She sat by the fire now, hands extended toward the flames, and even from across the room he could see she had stopped shivering. Color was beginning to return to her face. Caleb busied himself at the stove, pulling out the rabbit he had trapped that morning. He skinned and cleaned it with quick, efficient movements, then cut the meat into chunks and dropped them into the pot with water, dried potatoes, and carrots. He hung the pot over the fire on its iron hook and gave it a stir. "Are you hungry?" he asked. "I have not eaten in 2 days." Rabbit stew is not the finest meal in the world, but it fills the belly. Kiona watched the pot for a moment, then said, "It is better than wolves." Caleb stopped stirring, turned to look at her. For 3 seconds, neither of them moved. Then, surprising himself, he smiled. Just a slight upturn at the corner of his mouth, but it was there. The first genuine smile he had felt in longer than he could remember. "Yes," he agreed, "definitely better than wolves." And despite everything, despite the cold and the fear and the exhaustion, Kiona's lips quirked upward as well. They ate in silence 20 minutes later, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the scrape of spoons against tin bowls. Caleb had given her the larger portion and she ate slowly, methodically, like someone who had learned not to waste food. When she set her empty bowl aside, Caleb leaned back in his chair and asked the question he had been holding since the canyon. "Who left you there?" "You said family." Kiona's hands stilled in her lap. She looked at the fire for a long time before answering. "My cousin, Dakota, after my father died 3 weeks ago." "Why?" "Because my father left me something Dakota wanted, and when I refused to give it to him, he told the tribal council I had betrayed our people. Most of them believed him." "And the punishment was death by wolves?" "The punishment was being tied to the judgment tree in Raven's Gap. The spirits would decide if I was guilty. If I lived through the night, I was innocent. If I died, I was guilty." Her voice was bitter. "It is an old Cherokee tradition, convenient for those who want someone dead but do not want blood on their hands." Caleb studied her across the table. In the firelight, he could see the intelligence in her dark eyes, the set of her jaw that spoke of stubbornness and pride. She was not a victim, he realized. She was a survivor. There was a difference. "What did your father leave you that is worth killing for?" Kiona hesitated again. He could see her weighing whether to trust him with the truth. Finally, she said, "A rifle, a Sharp's rifle that belonged to him when he was a warrior. That is a fine weapon, but hardly worth murder. It is not the rifle itself, it is what the rifle shows. My father carved symbols into the stock. Apache symbols. Old ones. Only he and I know how to read them." "And what do they show?" Kiona met his eyes. "The location of 50 Springfield rifles, hidden since the Civil War. Enough weapons to arm a small army." Caleb leaned forward, suddenly very focused. "And Dakota wants these rifles. He wants to start a war. He believes if he arms the Cherokee and Apache in these mountains, He can drive out the white settlers and reclaim the land. He will call it justice, liberation, but it will be slaughter on both sides, and you will not help him. My father chose peace. He spent the last 20 years of his life building, not destroying. I will not betray that, not for Dakota, not for anyone. Caleb nodded slowly. He understood now. Understood why they had been willing to leave her to die. She was the only one who could lead them to those rifles. As long as she lived and refused to cooperate, their plan could not move forward. Dakota will come for you, he said, once he realizes you survived. I know. And when he does, there will be more than wolves. I know that too. Caleb stood, walked to the rifle leaning against the wall, and checked the action. He pulled a box of cartridges from a shelf and set them on the table. Then we prepare, he said simply. Because I did not pull you off that tree just to watch you die 3 days later. Kiona looked up at him, something shifting in her expression. Not quite trust yet, but the beginning of it. The recognition that maybe, just maybe, she had found an ally. Why, she asked. Why help me? You do not know me. You owe me nothing. Caleb looked at the photograph on the wall, at Sarah's smile, at the life he had failed to save 5 years ago. Because leaving you there would make me no better than the men who tied you up, and I am trying very hard not to be that kind of man anymore. Kiona did not respond immediately. When she did, her voice was quieter. Then I will help us prepare. I may not be a warrior, but my father taught me. I know how to fight when I must. I do not doubt it. He pointed to the bed. That is yours tonight. I will sleep on the floor by the fire. In the morning we will make plans. But tonight you rest. You are safe here. Kiona studied him one more time, then nodded. She stood, moved to the bed, and sat on its edge. As Caleb spread a blanket on the floor near the fireplace and lay down, he heard her voice from across the room. Caleb. Yes? Thank you for coming when you did. Sleep, Kiona. Tomorrow we have work to do. He closed his eyes, the rifle within arm's reach, and listened to the wind outside. Somewhere in the darkness, Dakota was learning that his cousin still lived. And when he did, he would come. Let him come, Caleb thought. Let him tremor. He had spent 5 years running from his past, hiding from his guilt, living like a ghost in the mountains. Maybe it was time to stand and fight for something again. For someone. The fire crackled. The wind blew. And in the small cabin in Thorns Hollow, 2 people who had every reason to give up instead chose to survive. Morning would bring new challenges. But for now, in the warmth and the quiet, that was enough. Caleb woke before first light, as he always did. 5 years of living alone in the mountains had trained his body to rise with the dark, when the cabin was coldest and the fire had burned down to embers. He lay still for a moment on the hard floor, wrapped in a single wool blanket, listening to the silence that came before dawn. The wind had died during the night. Outside, the world held its breath. He sat up slowly, joints protesting the cold and the unforgiving ground. His breath steamed in the frigid air. Across the small cabin, Kiona still slept on the bed, curled on her side under the thicker blanket he had given her. Her dark hair spilled across the rough pillow. Her breathing was deep and even, the sleep of someone whose body had finally surrendered to exhaustion after fighting death for hours. Caleb rose without making a sound, a skill learned in his scouting days when noise could mean an arrow in the dark. He moved to the fireplace and knelt before it, examining the ashen coals. A few embers still glowed orange beneath the gray. Good. He would not need to restart from scratch. He arranged small sticks of kindling in a pyramid over the embers, then worked the leather bellows with slow, steady pumps. Air fed the hidden fire. Within moments, tiny flames licked up around the dry wood. He added larger pieces, building the fire carefully, and soon warmth began to push back against the cold that had crept into every corner of the cabin during the night. The scrape of metal on iron, quiet as he tried to be, must have woken her. He heard movement behind him and turned to see Kiona sitting upright on the bed, the blanket pulled around her shoulders. Her eyes were alert, tracking his movements with the instinctive wariness of prey that knows the predator might still be near. "Did you sleep?" he asked, keeping his voice low. "Some." She paused, studying him. "More than I thought I would." He nodded and turned to the small stove, filling the battered coffee pot with water from the barrel. He added grounds, dark and coarse, and set it over the fire. Coffee was a luxury he allowed himself, traded for in Townsend once every few months. This morning they both needed it. He poured the steaming liquid into 2 tin cups when it was ready and carried one to the table near her. She stood, moving with visible stiffness, enjoying him. The bandages on her wrists showed spots of dried blood, brown against the white cotton. The wounds were bad, but not infected. Not yet. He would need to change those dressings today. They drank in silence for several minutes. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional pop of a log settling. Then Kiona set her cup down and looked at him directly. "There is something you need to know about last night." Caleb raised his eyebrows, waiting. "Before you woke, I could not sleep. I went to the window and looked outside." She paused. There were tracks in the snow. Fresh tracks, 3 horses, and boot prints from someone on foot. They came within 200 yards of this cabin from the northeast. They stopped. They stayed for some time. Then they left, heading east. Caleb set his own cup down carefully and moved to the eastern window. He unlatched the shutter and pushed it open a crack, letting in the gray pre-dawn light. And there, just as she had said, he could see them. Horse tracks, partially filled with new snow that had fallen during the night, but still clearly visible. They approached from the tree line, made a slow semicircle around the cabin's perimeter, then retreated back the way they had come. He studied the pattern more carefully. 3 sets of hoof prints, deep and widely spaced. Heavy horses, probably carrying armed men. And yes, boot prints too. Someone had dismounted and walked closer, studying the cabin from multiple angles. Caleb walked to the spot Kiona had indicated, 200 yards from the cabin. He squatted down, examining the ground with the careful eye of a scout. The hoof prints were there, just as she said. Deep impressions in the snow, partially filled but still visible. And there, near the base of a pine tree, something else. He picked it up carefully. A cigarette butt, hand-rolled, the paper damp but not frozen solid yet. Recent, then, within the last few hours. He returned to the cabin and showed it to Kiona. "You were right. They stood here, watching, smoking, taking their time. Learning our defenses," Kiona said. "Learning our routines. Dakota is many things, but careless is not one of them." "How do you know they were watching?" he asked. "They could have just been passing through." Kiona joined him at the window, looking out at the tracks. "Because of the pattern. See how they do not go straight? They came, they stopped there by those pines, and then they circled. That is what you do when you are scouting. When you are learning your enemy's position, their defenses, their weaknesses. My father taught me to read tracks like this when I was 8 years old. These men were not passing through. They were hunting." Caleb closed the shutter and latched it. His jaw was tight. Dakota's men. Or Dakota himself, though I doubt it. He would send scouts first. He is ambitious, but he is not stupid. Caleb returned to the table and sat, his mind already working through the implications. "Then they know you are here. They know I am here, and they will return." "Yes," Kiona said simply. "The question is when. And with how many?" Caleb looked at her across the table. "How many men does Dakota have? You said he had help." 12 men that I know of. 4 are Apache, warriors who believe his lies about reclaiming our land and driving out the white settlers. The other 8 are hired guns, white outlaws who will do anything if the price is right. Some of them are skilled fighters. Some are just killers who enjoy the work. 12 against 2, the mathematics were brutal. But Caleb had fought in worse situations during his cavalry days. He had seen a handful of men with good positioning hold off dozens. Numbers mattered, but they were not everything. Kiona was standing now, walking slowly around the cabin's interior. She moved with purpose, studying each wall, each window, each corner. Her hands trailed along the rough wood, testing, evaluating. When she completed her circuit, she turned to face him. "This cabin is too open," she said, her voice taking on a harder edge. "The windows are weak points. Any man with a rifle could shoot through them easily. The door has only that simple latch. A strong man could kick it in with 2 tries, maybe 3. If they come at night with numbers, we will be trapped here with no defenses worth mentioning. Caleb leaned back in his chair, interested now. What would you do differently? She pointed to the eastern window. Board these shut. Leave only narrow slots, just wide enough to push a rifle barrel through. That way we can shoot out, but they cannot shoot in. The door needs a heavy bar across it, something thick enough that even a battering ram would struggle. Oak, if you have it. She moved to the water barrel. And we need to store water inside, lots of it, every bucket and pot you have, filled. If they lay siege to this place, we cannot risk going outside to the creek. They would cut us down before we took 3 steps. Caleb found himself nodding. These were not amateur observations. This was tactical thinking, the kind that came from education and experience. Your father taught you this, he asked. Keona's expression softened slightly. My father was a warrior before he became a blacksmith. He fought against the U.S. Army in Arizona Territory for more than 10 years. He knew what it meant to be outnumbered. He knew what it meant to defend a position when retreat was not an option. He taught me that walls and preparation matter as much as weapons and courage. He sounds like he was a wise man. He was. Her voice went quiet, and pain flickered across her face. And Dakota poisoned him for it. Caleb sat forward, suddenly very focused. You are certain it was poison? I am certain. My father was strong as an oak tree. He could work the forge for 12 hours without tiring. Then suddenly, 3 weeks ago, he fell ill. His skin turned the color of old parchment, yellow and waxy. He could not keep food down. Every day he grew weaker, thinner. His hands shook. Near the end, he could barely speak. She met Caleb's eyes. I have seen arsenic poisoning before, during the wars in Arizona. I know the signs. Someone fed my father poison over many days until his body could fight no longer. But you have no proof. Not that I could take to your law, but there is a man in Townsend who might help. Elijah Crow. He is a blacksmith, like my father became. They were closest friends for 20 years. If anyone saw something, if anyone knows something, it would be Elijah. Caleb filed this information away in his mind. Evidence of murder would be valuable, but only if they survived long enough to present it. He stood and moved to the corner where he kept his tools. Then we have work to do. If they scouted us last night, they know where we are and how we are positioned. They will attack within 2 days, maybe 3. That gives us time to prepare, but not much. Keona nodded, rolling her shoulders as if preparing for battle. Tell me what needs doing. I may be wounded, but I am not useless. I never thought you were, Caleb replied, and he meant it. They worked for 6 days, transforming the simple cabin into something that could withstand a siege. On the first day, February 23rd, with the temperature hovering around 6 below zero, Caleb took his saw and axe into the woods and cut boards from fallen timber. Dead pine already dried and seasoned by time. He dragged the boards back through 2 feet of snow, his shoulders burning with the effort, and spent the afternoon nailing them across the windows from the inside. He left narrow slots, perhaps 3 inches wide and 12 inches tall, just enough room to sight down a rifle barrel, but not enough for return fire to find easy entrance. Keona could not lift the heavy boards with her wounded wrists, but she held nails, fetched tools from the shed, and kept constant watch on the tree line. Her eyes never stopped moving, scanning for threats. Caleb noticed she had positioned herself so she could see both approaches, east and west, without turning her head much. Smart, always thinking. By nightfall, both windows were secured. The cabin felt darker, more enclosed, but infinitely safer. On the second day, February 24th, they reinforced the door. Caleb had a thick oak beam stored in the shed, something he had cut years ago with no particular purpose in mind. Now it had one. He measured carefully, cut it to fit the width of the door, and fashioned heavy iron brackets that he bolted directly into the wall studs. When the beam was slotted into place, it would take a battering ram or an explosion to breach that door. He also installed a second lock and a length of chain as backup. Redundancy in defenses, he had learned in the cavalry, was the difference between living and dying. Keona watched him work, occasionally offering suggestions about angles and leverage points. Once, when he struggled with a particularly stubborn bolt, she stepped in and held the bracket steady while he tightened the nut. Their hands were close on the metal, nearly touching. He noticed the dried blood on her bandages and made a mental note to change them that evening. On the third day, February 25th, the temperature climbed to 0 and the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in a week. They took advantage of the slightly better weather to work outside. They dug a shallow trench 30 feet in front of the cabin's entrance. The ground was frozen solid for the first 6 inches, and Caleb had to use a pickaxe to break through before they could shovel. The work was brutal, exhausting, and by midday both of them were breathing hard and sweating despite the cold. The trench was not deep, perhaps 2 feet at most, but it was long enough to span the main approach. Caleb cut stakes from green saplings, sharpened them to wicked points, and angled them forward in the bottom of the trench. Then they covered it all with branches and a thin layer of snow. It would not stop a determined charge, but it would slow one down. And in a gunfight, a few seconds of confusion could mean the difference between life and death. While they worked, Kiona told him stories of her father, how Neshoba had been a feared warrior in his youth, leading raids against cavalry patrols and supply wagons, how he had killed his first enemy at 16 and had earned his name, which meant wolf for his cunning and ferocity, but also how he had grown tired of the killing, tired of watching young men die for causes that seemed to shift like sand, and how he had chosen to learn the blacksmith's trade instead. He said that making tools to build was better than making weapons to destroy, Kiona said as she arranged branches over the stakes. He said there was more honor in shoeing a horse than in killing a man, because the horse never asked for war. A wise man, Caleb repeated. Yes, too wise to live, apparently. On the fourth day, February 26th, Caleb woke to find Kiona already up, sitting by the window in the gray dawn light. She was flexing her hands, testing her wrists. The bandages were fresh, changed by her own hand during the night. We need to practice, she said without preamble. If they come, I will need to shoot, and I will need to shoot well. Caleb nodded. He had been thinking the same thing. After a cold breakfast of hardtack and dried venison, they rode 1 mile south to a clearing on the slope of Rich Mountain. The location was sheltered from wind by a ring of trees, and it offered clear sight lines out to 300 yards. Caleb set up targets, pieces of old deer hide, brown and weathered, that he tacked to tree trunks at various distances. The first at 50 yards, the second at 100, the third at 200, the fourth barely visible against the dark pines at 300 yards. He handed Kiona his Winchester rifle. You know how to shoot. Your father taught you that. But shooting a rabbit at close range, it is different from shooting a man at distance when you are cold and scared and he is shooting back. She checked the rifle's action, worked the lever to chamber around, and shouldered it. Her stance was good, weight balanced, left elbow tucked in for stability. She sighted on the 50-yard target and fired. The recoil surprised her. The bullet went wide, clipping bark 2 feet to the left of the hide. You are jerking the trigger, Caleb said, pulling instead of squeezing. Try again. This time breathe in deep. Let half of it out. Hold. And squeeze so gently you surprise yourself when it goes off. She tried again. This time the bullet tore through the edge of the hide. Better. They practiced for 3 hours that first day. By the end, Kiona could hit the 100-yard target consistently, the 200-yard target half the time, the 300-yard target not at all. It is harder than it looks, she admitted, rubbing her shoulder where the stock had been hammering it with each shot. It is, but you are learning fast. Tomorrow we try again. On the 5th day, February 27th, with the temperature climbing to 2 degrees above zero and actual sunshine warming their faces, they returned to the clearing. This time, Kiona hit the 200-yard target 3 times out of 5. The satisfaction on her face when she did was unmistakable. Caleb set up a new challenge. He tied a piece of cloth to a string and had her shoot at it while he waved it back and forth, simulating a moving target. She missed the first 6 shots. The 7th clipped the cloth. The 8th and 9th missed again. The 10th tore the cloth completely in half. You are a natural, Caleb said, lowering at his field glasses. Most people cannot do that in a month of practice. I am motivated, Kiona replied, ejecting the spent cartridge and working the bolt to chamber a fresh round. When someone tries to kill you once, you become very interested in making sure they do not succeed a second time. On the sixth day, February 28th, they returned to the clearing one final time. The temperature had climbed to 5 degrees. The snow was beginning to shrink slightly in the direct sun, though it would refreeze hard at night. Spring was still 6 weeks away, but the land are starting to remember what warmth felt like. Caleb set the targets at maximum distance, 300 yards. He placed 3 pieces of hide, each one marked with a circle of charcoal, no bigger than a man's head. Kiona settled into position. Prone on a blanket spread over the snow, the rifle resting on a small log for stability. She breathed in, let it out, found her rhythm, squeezed. The first shot rang out. Through his field glasses, Caleb saw the bullet punch through the left target, just inside the charcoal circle. She worked the bolt, acquired the second target, fired, hit. Center of the circle, third target. This time she took longer, compensating for the slight breeze that had picked up, reading the snow blowing across the ground to judge windage. The rifle cracked. The bullet struck dead center. Caleb lowered the glasses and looked at her with genuine respect. 3 for 3 at 300 yards. You could scout for the cavalry with shooting like that. Kiona stood and brushed snow from her clothes. For the first time since he had found her at Raven's Gap, she smiled, really smiled. It transformed her face, made her look younger, less haunted. My father would have been proud, she said quietly. Your father would have been right to be proud. In exchange for the shooting lessons, Kiona taught Caleb the knowledge her father had passed down to her. Apache medicine, learned over generations, refined through necessity when doctors and supplies were luxuries that people could not afford. She showed him how to identify healing plants even in winter. The dried seed heads of wild ginger, which when dug up and ground into paste, could fight infection better than anything sold in a Townsend pharmacy. The inner bark of willow trees, which when boiled made a tea that reduced fever and pain. The roots of certain ferns that could stop bleeding when pressed into wounds. On the sixth day, while Caleb was sharpening steaks in the afternoon, the knife slipped and opened a cut across his left palm. Not deep, but long, bleeding freely. He cursed and pressed his hand closed, applying pressure. Kiona was there in seconds. She took his hand without asking permission, examined the cut with a practiced eye, and nodded to herself. Wait here. She went outside and returned 5 minutes later with a clump of plant material she had dug from beneath the snow. She ground it between 2 stones, mixing it with a little water from the barrel until it formed a green paste that smelled sharp and medicinal. This will sting, she warned. It did. It stung like fire ants and hot coals combined. Caleb hissed through his teeth but did not pull away. She packed the paste into the cut, then wrapped his hand with a clean strip of cloth. Your people have forgotten more about healing than mine ever learned, Caleb observed, watching her work. My people have had to learn, Kiona replied without looking up. We did not have army doctors following us with medicine wagons full of morphine and laudanum. We had what the land provided and what our grandmothers taught us. So we learned to see what others missed. By the next morning, the cut had sealed cleanly. No red lines spreading up his arm, no swelling or heat, just healthy healing. Caleb looked at his bandaged hand with new appreciation for knowledge that could not be bought or stolen, only earned through generations of survival. On the evening of the sixth day, February 28th, they sat by the fire after a simple meal of venison stew. The cabin was warm now, the door barred, the windows secured. Outside, night had fallen, and with it came a cold so intense that the logs in the walls cracked and popped, like rifle shots as they contracted. They had not spoken much during dinner. Both were tired from the work, from the constant vigilance, from the weight of knowing that tomorrow or the next day might bring violence and death. But now, with the bowls cleaned and set aside, with the fire crackling and the darkness pressing close outside, Kiona broke the silence. Tell me about the woman in the photograph. Caleb had known this question would come eventually. He had seen Kiona's eyes linger on the picture several times over the past week. The photograph of Sarah, frozen forever in a moment of happiness that now felt like it belonged to a different lifetime. Her name was Sarah, he said, staring into the fire rather than at Kiona. She was my wife. Was. She died 5 years ago, in June of 1873, in Arizona Territory. Kiona waited, patient, not pushing, just listening. And maybe it was the exhaustion or the knowledge that violence was coming and he might not have another chance to speak these words, or simply that he had carried them alone for so long that they had become too heavy to bear in silence anymore. Whatever the reason, Caleb found himself talking. I was a scout for the United States Cavalry, captain's rank, though I never wore the uniform. My job was to find trails through hostile territory, to lead columns to water, to track Apache war parties and report their positions. It was work, nothing more. I told myself I was just doing a job. He paused and the silence stretched until he found the strength to continue. Sarah was a volunteer nurse. She had trained in Philadelphia. Good family, good education, could have married a banker or a lawyer. Instead, she came west to help. She wanted to bring medicine to people who needed it, regardless of who they were or what color their skin was. That was Sarah. She saw suffering and she had to help. The fire popped. A log settled. Still, Caleb did not look at Kiona. In June of 1873, my commanding officer was Captain Charles Morrison. He was West Point educated from a Virginia family, and he had very particular ideas about how the Indian problem should be solved. His solution involved bullets more than treaties. I knew this, but I told myself it was not my concern. I was just a scout. Now the bitterness crept into his voice. Morrison ordered me to guide his company to an Apache camp north of Fort Apache. He said we were going to negotiate peace, to establish trade relations, to offer medicine for their sick. Sarah wanted to come, wanted to help the children who were suffering from fever. I let her. God help me, I let her. Kiona leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving his face. We reached the camp at midday, maybe 200 people, mostly women and children and old men. The warriors were out hunting. Sarah went in first, carrying her medical bag and a white flag. The Apache let her approach. They let her begin treating their sick children. She was laughing. I remember that. She was laughing because a little girl had made a joke in broken English about white people smelling like wet dogs. His voice cracked. He steadied it. That was when Morrison gave the order to open fire. Kiona's breath caught. It was a massacre planned from the start. The talk of peace and medicine was bait to get them to lower their guard. I realized it when I heard the bugle call. I tried to stop it, ran toward Morrison shouting. But the soldiers had already opened fire. The camp became hell. Screaming blood, smoke from black powder, thick as fog. Caleb closed his eyes, but the images remained. I ran into the camp, found Sarah lying in the dirt near one of the lodges. There was a bullet hole in her chest. Her blood was soaking into the dust. One of our own soldiers had shot her, mistaking her for Apache because she was wearing buckskin against the sun. When he opened his eyes, they were wet. She looked at me. Her lips moved. She said just one word. Why? Why, Caleb? And I had no answer for her, or I have no answer for her still. The cabin was absolutely silent except for the fire. She died in my arms. It took maybe 2 minutes. Then I laid her down gently, stood up, walked back through the camp, and found Morrison. He was laughing with his officers, celebrating their victory, talking about promotions and commendations. Caleb's jaw was clenched so hard his teeth ached. I walked up to him. He turned, started to say something. I shot him once, center mass. He went down and he did not get back up. Then I mounted my horse and I rode away. I have been riding away ever since. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Kiona spoke, and her voice was gentle in a way he had not heard before. My father used to say that mistakes do not define us. Not the mistakes we make, and not the mistakes made against us. What defines us is how we live after the mistake, how we choose to carry the weight. You could not save Sarah. The guilt of that has been crushing you for 5 years. But 6 days ago, you saved me. That is who you are, Caleb. Not the man who failed 5 years ago. The man who succeeded 6 days ago. That is who you are now. Caleb looked at her finally, meeting her eyes across the fire. He saw compassion there and understanding, and something else he could not quite name. I am trying to believe that, he said, his voice rough. Some days are easier than others. Then I will believe it for both of us, Kiona replied, until the day comes when you can believe it yourself. They sat together in the firelight for a long time after that, neither speaking, both lost in their own thoughts. But somehow the silence felt less heavy than it had before, shared instead of solitary. Eventually, Caleb stood and added wood to the fire. We should rest. Tomorrow will bring what it brings, and we need to be ready. Kiona nodded and moved toward the bed, but before she lay down, she turned back to him. Thank you, Caleb, for telling me, for trusting me with it. Thank you for listening and for not judging. There is nothing to judge. You are a good man who was put in an impossible situation. That is all. She lay down and pulled the blanket over herself. Within minutes, her breathing had slowed into the rhythm of sleep. Caleb spread his own blanket on the floor near the fire and lay down, the rifle within arm's reach, as always. He stared at the ceiling, watching shadows dance in the firelight, thinking about Sarah and about Kiona, and about how strange it was that saving one life could not erase the guilt of failing another. But it could make the guilt bearable, could make it something other than an anchor dragging him down into darkness. He closed his eyes. Tomorrow would bring what it brought. Tonight, for the first time in 5 years, he was not entirely alone with his ghosts. Morning came, and with it, a knock at the door. Both Caleb and Kiona came awake instantly. Years of living with danger had trained them both to sleep light and wake fast. Caleb grabbed the Winchester. Kiona took the Colt revolver. They moved to opposite sides of the door in absolute silence, weapons ready, hearts pounding. "Who is there?" Caleb called, keeping his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "Do not shoot, friend," came a voice from outside. Older, deep, with the careful pronunciation of someone who had learned English as a second language. "My name is Elijah Crow. I am not your enemy. I am looking for Kiona, daughter of Neshoba." Caleb glanced at Kiona. Her eyes had gone wide with recognition. He cracked the door open 6 inches, keeping the rifle barrel visible in the gap. Standing 20 feet away in the snow, clearly visible in the morning light, was a black man in his early 60s. Gray hair, weathered face, wearing a blacksmith's leather apron beneath a heavy coat. His hands were raised to shoulder height, empty and open. Behind him, a mule was tied to a tree, its saddlebags bulging. "Elijah?" Kiona pushed past Caleb and threw the door fully open. "Ong, Elijah?" The man's face transformed with relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. "Kiona, child, thank the Lord. They told me you were dead." Kiona ran through the snow without bothering with a coat and threw her arms around the older man. He hugged her back with the fierce protectiveness of a father reunited with a lost daughter. When they separated, both had tears streaming down their faces. Caleb lowered the rifle but did not set it aside. "You had better come inside. It is too cold to stand out here, and we have much to discuss." Inside the cabin, with the door barred again and fresh coffee brewing, Elijah Crow told his story. "Neshoba was my closest friend for 20 years," that he began, wrapping his hands around the tin cup Caleb had given him. "Back in 1858, I was newly freed, trying to make my way west to start a new life. Somewhere near the New Mexico border, a gang of outlaws attacked me, beat me, robbed me, were about to finish me off when a man appeared out of nowhere. Apache, moving like smoke. He killed 2 of them with a knife so fast I barely saw it happen. The others ran." Elijah's eyes were distant, remembering. "I asked him why he saved me. He said only that leaving me to die would have been wrong." That was Neshoba. He saw right and wrong clearly, without complication. We became friends that day. When he moved to Tennessee 7 years ago, I followed, set up my forge in Townsend. We worked side by side, 2 old warriors pretending to be peaceful tradesmen. He took a long drink of coffee, then continued. 3 weeks ago, Neshoba fell ill. It came on sudden. One day he was strong as an oak, the next he could barely stand. His skin turned yellow. He shook. He vomited everything he tried to eat. I knew something was wrong, but I did not want to believe what I suspected. "Poison," Kiona said flatly. "Yes, arsenic, I think. I have seen it before during the war. Men used it to murder each other when they wanted it to look like natural illness." Elijah set his cup down and reached into his coat. He pulled out a small glass vial filled with white powder and placed it on the table. The sight of it made Kiona's hands clench into fists. "On February 10th, Elijah continued, his voice heavy with shame, "I was at Neshoba's lodge, helping him with some metalwork he was too weak to finish. Dakota came in. He did not see me, in the back corner. I watched him pour this powder into Neshoba's whiskey bottle. When I stepped forward and asked what he was doing, he smiled at me. Smiled. And he said, if I spoke a word of what I had seen to anyone, he would kill my grandson Henry. The boy is 8 years old, Kiona. He is all I have left of my family. So you said nothing, Caleb observed without judgment in his tone. I said nothing. I kept my head down. And 5 days later, Neshoba died. I have not slept through a full night since. Every time I close my eyes, I see his face, asking me without words why I did not help him. Tears rolled down the old man's cheeks. Yesterday, I was in the Townsend saloon buying nails for the forge. One of Dakota's hired men, a white outlaw named Billy Hatcher, was there. He got drunk on cheap whiskey and started bragging to anyone who would listen. Said they were going to clean up a problem at Cade's Cove tonight. I knew he meant this cabin. Knew he meant Kiona. Elijah looked at her directly. I could not stay silent again. Henry will understand when he is older, or he will not. But I will not stand by and let another person die because I was too afraid to act. So I came. I brought my shotgun and what ammunition I have. If Dakota comes tonight, he will have to go through me too. Kiona reached across the table and took the old man's hand. You came. That is what matters. My father would forgive you. I forgive you. I do not forgive myself, but I will try to earn forgiveness through action. Caleb stood and began pacing, his mind already working through tactical problems. If they were drunk and talking yesterday, they will be sober and attacking today. Probably tonight when darkness gives them cover. How many men are we facing? 12 as far as I know, could be more. Dakota has been recruiting. And you? How are you with a gun? Elijah smiled grimly. I have not fired a rifle in 10 years. My eyes are not what they were. But a shotgun does not require precision, just pointing in the right direction. And I am very good at pointing in the right direction. They spent the rest of the day making final preparations. Elijah proved surprisingly useful, his blacksmith's strength still evident despite his age. He helped Caleb reinforce the northern wall with extra logs, bracing them against the rock face behind the cabin for additional support. They filled every container in the cabin with water from Abrams Creek, carrying bucket after bucket through the snow until they had enough to last 3 days if needed. They distributed ammunition strategically around the cabin, boxes by each window, extras near the door, a reserve supply in the corner. If they got pinned down in one location, they would not run dry. Caleb checked and rechecked his weapons. Winchester rifle, cleaned and oiled. Colt revolver, cylinders loaded with fresh cartridges. Knife, sharpened to a razor edge. Kiona did the same with the guns he had given her. As the sun began its descent toward the western ridges, casting long shadows across the snow, they gathered around the table and reviewed their defensive plan one final time. Caleb would take the eastern window, covering the main approach. Kiona would cover the western window. Elijah would guard the door with his shotgun, and if anyone got through the outside defenses, he would be the last line. If all three positions were overwhelmed, they would retreat to the center of the cabin and fight back-to-back in close quarters. And if that failed, there was the hidden door in the back wall, concealed behind a hanging blanket. It led to a narrow passage carved into the rock face, barely wide enough for one person at a time. The passage opened onto a trail that switched back up the mountainside and eventually led to a network of caves 3 miles north. It was their escape route, to be used only if everything else fell apart. As darkness fell and the temperature plummeted, they ate a cold supper of jerky and hardtack, not wanting smoke from cooking to give away their readiness. They spoke little. Everything that needed saying had been said. Each of them checked their weapons one final time by lamplight. Each of them thought about the hours ahead and what those hours might bring. At exactly 10 o'clock at night, the attack began. The first warning was sound, the muffled thud of hoofbeats in snow coming from multiple directions at once. Caleb was at his window before the sound fully registered. He peered through the firing slot, eyes straining in the darkness. Movement, shadows separating from shadows. Riders advancing through the trees from the east, trying to stay quiet, not quite succeeding. He counted them quickly. 8, no, 9. 9 riders spread in a loose line, closing the distance at a walk. "Contact east," he called softly. 9 riders, maybe more behind. "I have movement west," Kiona reported from her position. 3 riders. They are trying to flank us. "Smart," Elijah muttered from his position by the door. "Split our attention. Make us choose where to focus fire." Caleb watched the eastern group advance. 100 yards, 80, 60. They were becoming more visible now as his eyes adjusted. Men on horseback, rifles held at the ready, moving with the confidence of superior numbers. 50 yards. He shouldered the Winchester, settling the stock firmly against his shoulder. Selected his target, the rider in front, slightly ahead of the others. He would be the leader of this group, the one calling signals. Take him down first, disrupt their coordination. He exhaled slowly, found the space between heartbeats, and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester cracked like a thunderbolt in the night silence. Through the gun smoke, Caleb saw his target pitch backward off his horse. The animal bolted sideways. The other riders scattered, returning fire blindly. Muzzle flashes bright in the darkness. Bullets hammered into the cabin walls. One punched through the wooden window cover 3 inches from Caleb's head, showering him with splinters. He dropped below the slot, worked the lever action to eject the spent cartridge and chamber a fresh round, then popped back up and fired again. Another rider fell. To his left, Kiona's Colt barked twice in rapid succession. From the western approach came a scream, then more gunfire, the distinctive crack of rifles mixing with the deeper boom of revolvers. At the door, Elijah's shotgun roared like an angry god. The double load of buckshot caught a dismounted attacker at close range. The man was hurled backward into the snow and did not move again. The fight continued without pause. The interior of the cabin filled with choking gun smoke. Spent brass clattered to the floor. Caleb fired, worked the lever, fired again. Picked targets in the confusion of muzzle flashes. A man running toward the cabin. Down. A man taking aim from behind a tree. Down. A man trying to circle around the trench trap. He stepped in it, screamed as the sharpened stakes punched through his boot, and Caleb dropped him with a mercy shot. Kiona's revolver clicked empty. In the dim light, Caleb saw her reload with smooth, practiced motions. 6 fresh cartridges from her pocket, thumbed into the cylinder one after another without fumbling despite the chaos and noise. Then she was back at the window, firing controlled shots at targets he could not see from his position. Elijah reloaded his shotgun, the metallic snap of the breech closing distinct even in the cacophony. The old man's face was set in hard lines, all traces of shame and hesitation burned away by the immediacy of violence. 10 minutes. The battle lasted 10 brutal minutes. Then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. A voice called from the darkness, carrying clear over the ringing in their ears. Fall back to the hollow! Move, damn you!" The surviving attackers retreated, some on horseback, some on foot, dragging wounded comrades with them. Within 2 minutes, the night was silent again, except for the moaning of one man left behind in the snow. His cries grew weaker, then stopped. The cold finished what the bullets had started. Caleb carefully unbarred the door and opened it a crack, rifle ready. The scene outside was carnage. 2 bodies lay within 20 feet of the cabin, dark shapes in the white snow. 3 more were visible further out. Blood trails led away into the trees where the wounded had been dragged to safety. He counted the evidence, doing the grim mathematics of battle. They had killed at least 5 of Dakota's men outright, wounded perhaps 3 or 4 more, some seriously enough that they might not survive the night even with help. But at least 4 or 5 had escaped unharmed and would be able to fight again. And Dakota himself had not been among the attackers. He was too smart for that. He sent his men to probe the defenses while he watched from safety. Caleb closed the door and dropped the bar back into place. He turned to survey the cabin's interior. Gunsmoke hung thick as fog. The acrid smell of burned black powder filled his nose and throat. Dozens of spent cartridge casings littered the floor, glinting dully in the lamplight. The walls had at least 20 new bullet holes, some clean through, some stopped by the thickness of the logs, but they were all alive. "Anyone hit?" he asked. "Scratches," Kiona replied, touching her cheek where a splinter had drawn a thin line of blood. "Nothing that matters." "I am too old for this excitement," Elijah muttered, but he was grinning fiercely. but not so old I cannot fight when I must. Caleb allowed himself a small smile. They had won the first round, but there would be others. Dakota would not stop. Men like him never stopped until they got what they wanted or died trying. An hour later, with the fire rebuilt and strong coffee brewing, they sat around the table and took careful stock of their situation. Ammunition count, Caleb said. Kiona checked the boxes. 68 rounds for the rifles, 24 for the revolvers, 6 shotgun shells remaining. Enough for one more fight like that, Elijah observed. Maybe 2 if we are very careful and very lucky. They will come again, Kiona said. Dakota will not give up. He cannot afford to. Too many people know now what he is attempting. If he backs down, he loses everything. Face, followers, his chance at the rifles. Caleb stared into his coffee cup, thinking hard. She was right. They could not stay here indefinitely. Even if they survived another attack, eventually they would run out of ammunition or food or simply make a mistake when exhaustion overcame caution. They could not win a war of attrition, not with 12-1 odds, even reduced to 7 or 8-1 now. They had to change the game. The rifles your father hid, he said, looking up at Kiona, the 50 Springfields. Where exactly are they? In a cave called Bear's Maw. It is at the base of Gregory Bald, in the high country north of here. 20 miles, perhaps slightly more. Can you find it? Yes, my father took me there twice when I was younger. Once when he first hid the rifles, and once years later to show me the symbols he had carved. I know the way. Caleb nodded slowly, the plan forming in his mind. Then that is where we go. At first light tomorrow. We get to those rifles before Dakota figures out we have moved. We destroy them so they can never be used. And along the way, we gather whatever evidence we can of Dakota's crimes. Then we bring it all to the law in Townsend and let justice take its course. Elijah stroked his gray beard thoughtfully. Marshall Hayes is a fair man, hard but fair. If we have proof, real proof, he will act. He has no love for men who break the law, regardless of their color or their cause. Can we make 20 miles through hostile territory? Kiona asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. We can, Caleb replied with more confidence than he felt, because the alternative is staying here and eventually being overwhelmed. I did not survive 5 years alone in these mountains by sitting still and waiting for death to find me, and I am not about to start now. They rested in shifts that night, 2 sleeping while 1 kept watch. The cabin remained quiet. No further attacks came. Outside, the cold deepened and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. Somewhere to the east in Devil's Hollow, Dakota and his remaining men were regrouping, treating their wounded, burying their dead, planning their next move. But inside the small cabin in Thorns Hollow, 3 people who had every reason to give up were instead preparing to take the fight to the enemy. At dawn on March 1st, with the sky just beginning to lighten from black to gray, they made their final preparations. Caleb loaded saddlebags with ammunition, dried food, rope, and basic supplies. Elijah fetched his mule and 2 additional horses he had brought, hidden in the woods half a mile away. Kiona wrapped herself in warm layers and checked her weapons one last time with the efficiency of someone who knew their life might depend on being able to draw and fire in seconds. Before they mounted up, Caleb walked to the photograph of Sarah hanging on the cabin wall. He touched the frame lightly with his fingertips, a gesture of farewell or perhaps of promise. Kiona came to stand beside him. She would be proud of you, she said quietly, for standing when you could have run, for fighting when you could have hidden. I hope you are right, Caleb replied. God help me, I hope you are right. They rode out as the sun broke over the eastern ridge, 3 riders on 3 horses heading north into the high country, into danger, into uncertainty, into whatever fate waited at a cave called Bear's Maw. But they were not running anymore. They were not hiding. They were taking the fight to Dakota, and that made all the difference. For the first time in 5 years, Caleb Thorne was moving forward instead of away, and beside him rode 2 people who had become something more than allies. They had become the thing he thought he had lost forever when Sarah died. They had become family. The mountains watched them go in silence, and the snow held the marks of their passage like a promise written in white. The journey north began in silence, broken only by the crunch of hooves through crusted snow and the occasional creak of leather saddles. The temperature hovered just above zero, cold enough that breath steamed from both horses and riders, creating small clouds that dissipated quickly in the still morning air. The sky was clear for the first time in days, a pale blue stretching from horizon to horizon, and the sun climbing over the eastern peaks cast long shadows across the white landscape. Caleb rode in front, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain ahead for threats or obstacles. Behind him came Kiona, sitting straight in her saddle despite her exhaustion, the Winchester rifle across her lap within easy reach. Elijah brought up the rear on his sturdy mule, his shotgun secured in a leather scabbard, but positioned so he could draw it in seconds if needed. They followed a route that avoided the main trails, staying instead to the dense forest where the canopy overhead provided some cover from observation. Caleb knew this country. He had spent 5 years learning every ridge, every creek, every hidden path that could carry a man from one valley to another without being seen. That knowledge would keep them alive today. The first leg of the journey took them along Abrams Creek, following the frozen waterway north for 2 miles until it bent west. The ice was thick enough to support their weight in most places, but Caleb tested it carefully before allowing the horses onto it. A fall through the ice this far from help would be a death sentence. As they rode, Kiona moved her horse closer to Caleb's and spoke quietly. "When we left the cabin, I saw smoke to the east. 2 miles, maybe 3. They are still at Devil's Hollow." "Good," Caleb replied. "That means they are not ahead of us. Not yet. But they will come after us when they realize we have left." "Yes, we have perhaps 6 hours before they find the empty cabin and pick up our trail. Maybe 8 if we are lucky. We need to be at Bear's Maw before then. 20 miles in 8 hours through mountain terrain in winter. It would be close." They left the creek behind and began climbing through a dense stand of hemlocks, the ground rising steadily beneath them. The horses labored in the deep snow, their breath coming harder. Twice they had to dismount and lead the animals through particularly difficult sections where fallen timber blocked the way. At mid-morning they reached the base of Thunderhead Ridge. The slope rose sharply before them, a wall of rock and ice and skeletal trees climbing toward the sky. This was the most dangerous part of the journey. The ridge had to be crossed to reach the territory beyond, and there was only one practical route. A narrow trail that switchbacked up the eastern face, exposed to wind and observation, with cliffs dropping away on one side and sheer rock rising on the other. Caleb studied the ascent through narrowed eyes. "We go one at a time. If anyone falls, I do not want them taking the others down with them. I will go first. Kiona second. Elijah last. Keep 50 feet between riders. And do not look down." He started up the trail, his horse picking its way carefully over ice-covered rocks. The wind hit him immediately, funneling through the ridge with enough force to rock him in the saddle. He leaned forward, gripping with his knees, trusting the horse's instincts more than his own vision. To his right, the world dropped away into empty air. One stumble, one patch of ice in the wrong place, and he would fall 300 feet to the rocks below. The horse slipped once, its rear hooves skittering on ice, and for a heart-stopping moment, Caleb thought they were going over. But the animal recovered, muscles bunching as it found purchase, and lunged forward. Caleb let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. Behind him, Kiona began her ascent. He could not turn to watch, needed all his attention on the trail ahead, but he heard the steady click of her horse's hooves on stone and knew she was managing. It took 40 minutes to reach the top. 40 minutes of intense concentration and cold so severe that his face went numb despite the wool scarf wrapped around it. When his horse finally stepped onto level ground at the ridge crest, Caleb dismounted and waited for the others. Kiona appeared next, her face pale but determined. She had made it without incident. Then Elijah, the old man gripping his saddle horn with white-knuckled hands but otherwise showing no fear. "I have done many foolish things in my life," Elijah said as he dismounted, "but that may be the most foolish." "It gets easier on the descent," Caleb lied. It did not get easier. But sometimes lies were kinder than truth. From the ridge crest, they could see for miles in every direction. To the south, the valley they had left behind, with a thin column of smoke marking Devil's Hollow, where Dakota's men still camped. To the east and west, endless ranks of mountains marching toward distant horizons. And to the north, rising like a sleeping giant, Gregory Bald. Somewhere at its base, hidden in a fold of the mountain, was Bear's Maw Cave. They were halfway there. The descent proved every bit as treacherous as the climb, but faster. By early afternoon, they had reached the valley floor and on the ridge's northern side and entered what the locals called the Dead Pine Forest. It was an eerie place. 3 years ago, a wildfire had swept through this section of the mountains, consuming everything in its path. The trees still stood, but they were blackened husks, skeletal fingers reaching toward the sky. No birds sang here. No animals moved. The silence was absolute and oppressive, broken only by the sound of their passage. "This place makes my skin crawl," Elijah muttered, looking around nervously. "The Cherokee call it the Forest of Ghosts," Kiona said. "They say the spirits of those who died in the fire still wander here, confused and angry." "I do not believe in ghosts," Caleb said, though even he felt the wrongness of this place. "But I do not like it either." We moved through quickly. They pushed the horses to a faster pace, eager to be clear of the dead forest. The burned trees seemed to watch them pass with hollow, accusing silence. Once, Caleb thought he heard a sound behind them, like footsteps in snow. But when he turned, there was nothing, just the empty forest and the wind moving through dead branches. It took them 20 minutes to traverse the forest and emerge on the far side. The relief was immediate and palpable. Ahead, the land opened into a small valley with living trees and snow that looked clean and white instead of ash-stained. They paused at a small creek to water the horses and refill their canteens. The animals drank deeply, sides heaving from the hard travel. Caleb judged they had perhaps 2 more hours of daylight, maybe 3. They would reach Gregory Ball before dark, but not by much. As Kiona knelt by the creek filling her canteen, a sound carried across the still air from behind them, distant but unmistakable. The baying of dogs. All 3 of them froze. Caleb's hand went to his rifle. "They are tracking us." "How far back?" Kiona asked, standing quickly. Caleb listened, trying to judge distance by sound. 2 miles, maybe 3. They must have found the empty cabin sooner than I expected and brought tracking dogs. "Can we outrun them?" Elijah asked. "Not with the horses already tired. We need to buy time." Caleb looked around quickly, mind racing through options. "There, that stream. We ride up it for a quarter mile, then exit on the far bank. It will kill our scent. The dogs will have to cast around to find where we left the water. That gives us an hour, maybe more." They remounted and urged the horses into the stream. The water was shallow but bitterly cold, just barely flowing beneath a skin of ice. They followed it north, the horses picking their way over slippery rocks until Caleb found what he was looking for. A section where the bank had collapsed, creating an easy exit that would not leave obvious tracks. They climbed out and continued north at a pace just short of a gallop, eating up the miles. The land rose steadily now, climbing toward the foothills of Gregory Bald. Behind them, the dogs continued baying, still distant, but perhaps slightly closer. It was going to be very close. They reached the lower slopes of Gregory Bald as the sun touched the western peaks. Ahead, Caleb could see the rock formations that marked the approach to Bear's Maw. Strange pillars of stone, weathered by time into shapes that resembled ancient standing figures. The Cherokee considered this a sacred place. The Apache who had settled in these mountains had agreed. Some places, the old people said, were thin, places where the world of spirits pressed close against the world of flesh. This was such a place. As they rounded a formation that looked like a hooded giant, an old man stepped into their path. Caleb's rifle was halfway to his shoulder before Kiona grabbed his arm. "Wait, I know him." The man was ancient, or at least appeared so. His face was a map of wrinkles, his hair a fall of white that reached past his shoulders. He wore traditional Cherokee clothing, buckskin and beads, and carried a staff of carved oak. But his eyes were sharp and clear, missing nothing. "Red Sky Walker," Kiona said, dismounting and approaching with clear respect. "Grandfather, I did not expect to see you here." The old man, Red Sky Walker, principal chief of the Little River Cherokee and Apache people, studied her for a long moment. Then surprisingly, he smiled. "Kiona, daughter of Neshoba, I heard you were dead. I am pleased to find that rumor was false. Dakota wanted me dead. He failed. Yes, Dakota has failed at many things. Understanding honor, understanding Ruth, understanding that some secrets should remain secret. Red Sky's eyes moved to the north, toward where Bear's Maw lay hidden. You go to the cave. It was not a question. We must, Kiona replied. The rifles cannot fall into Dakota's hands. I agree. That is why I sealed the main entrance 3 days ago. Red Sky tapped his staff on the ground. After Neshoba died and I learned the truth of how he died, I came here. I blocked the entrance with stones, enough that it would take days to dig through. But your father was clever. He showed me another way in years ago, a secret path. He said if anything happened to him, I should help you if you came here. He knew, Kiona whispered. He knew Dakota would poison him. Neshoba was many things, but never foolish. He saw Dakota's ambition, saw the hunger in his eyes, and he prepared. Red Sky moved closer, his voice dropping. The secret entrance is on the western face of the cave formation. There are symbols carved in the rock. A bear, a moon, water. You press them in that order, and a door opens. Inside is a tunnel, narrow, that leads to the main chamber. Only one person can pass through at a time. He reached out and placed a weathered hand on Kiona's head, a gesture of blessing. Your father was my friend. You are his daughter. I trust you to finish what he started. Keep those weapons from becoming instruments of war, and when you are done, come to Little River Camp. We will hold council. Dakota will face justice for what he has done. Thank you, grandfather. Red Sky stepped aside, then paused. Be careful. Dakota arrived here 2 hours before you. He has 10 men with him now, and they are trying to break through the stones I placed. You will have to be very quiet, very careful. As the old chief disappeared back into the forest with the silent grace of smoke, Caleb turned to Kiona. Dakota is already here. That changes things. It does not change what we must do, Kiona replied, her jaw set. We destroy the rifles. We stop him. They left the horses tied in a sheltered hollow a quarter-mile from the cave and continued on foot, moving with exaggerated caution through the lengthening shadows. As they drew closer, they could hear sounds. The ring of metal on stone, men cursing, the scrape of rocks being moved. Caleb crept forward and peered around a boulder. There it was, Bear's Maw Cave. The entrance was enormous, easily 40 feet tall, the rock formations around it creating the distinctive shape of a gaping jaw filled with stone teeth. And there, blocking the entrance, was a massive pile of boulders, at least 10 feet of solid rock, placed with obvious care. 10 men worked at the pile, trying to shift the stones. But Red Sky had done his work well. The boulders were too large to move easily, too tightly wedged to extract without tools and time. It would take them days to break through this way. Standing apart from the workers, watching with barely contained fury, was a man Caleb had never seen but recognized instantly. Dakota, tall, perhaps 6 feet even, with broad shoulders and the bearing of a warrior. He wore a mix of Apache traditional clothing and practical trail gear. In his hands was a rifle, not just any rifle, a Sharps, beautifully maintained, with intricate symbols carved into the wooden stock. Neshoba's rifle, the rifle with the map. Caleb pulled back and rejoined Kiona and Elijah. Red Sky was right. They are trying to break through the main entrance. It will take them at least 2 more days at the rate they are going. We need to find the secret entrance and get inside before they realize there is another way. They circled wide to the west, staying low, using the rock formations for cover. It took 15 minutes of careful searching before Kiona found what they were looking for. A section of cliff face that looked like solid rock, but when examined closely, showed 3 symbols carved into the stone. A bear, a moon, 3 wavy lines representing water. Kiona pressed them in sequence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a grinding sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet evening, a section of rock swung inward. Not a large opening, perhaps 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, a hole barely big enough for a person to crawl through. Beyond it was darkness. I will go first, Caleb said, checking his rifle. Then Kiona. Elijah, you follow and watch our backs. If we are not out in 30 minutes, go for help. Do not wait longer than that. 30 minutes, Elijah agreed, pulling out his pocket watch. Lord, keep you safe. Caleb got down on hands and knees and entered the tunnel. The darkness swallowed him immediately, He had a small candle in his pocket and lit it, the flickering light revealing a passage that extended ahead as far as he could see. The walls were close, claustrophobic, pressing in from both sides. The ceiling was low enough that he had to stay on his belly, pulling himself forward with his elbows. Behind him, he heard Kiona enter the tunnel. Her breathing echoed in the confined space. Then Elijah's heavier presence. They crawled and crawled and crawled. The tunnel seemed endless. Caleb's shoulders scraped against stone. His knees complained against the hard rock. The air was stale, tasting of earth and age. Once, a piece of the ceiling crumbled and showered him with pebbles. He paused, heart hammering, waiting to see if the whole tunnel would collapse. It held. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes, he saw light ahead. Not bright light, just a faint orange glow that suggested fire or torches. He blew out his candle and continued forward more carefully, making as little sound as possible. The tunnel ended abruptly, opening into a vast space. Caleb emerged from the hole and found himself on a natural ledge about 10 feet above the floor of an enormous cavern. He moved aside to let Kiona and then Elijah through, and together they crouched in the shadows, taking in the scene below. The main chamber of Bear's Maw Cave was spectacular. The ceiling soared 50 feet overhead, studded with stalactites that gleamed in torchlight. The walls curved outward, creating a roughly circular space perhaps 200 feet across. And there, in the center of the chamber, were 10 large wooden crates. The rifles. 50 Springfield rifles still in their original military crates. Enough firepower to arm a small army. But they were not alone in the cave. Dakota and 6 of his men had entered through a side passage, one that apparently connected to the block main entrance. They stood around the crates, examining them with satisfaction. Dakota had set down his Sharps rifle and was using a crowbar to pry open one of the crates. Finally, Dakota's voice echoed in the vast space. After all this time, everything Neshoba tried to hide, everything that fool thought he could keep from me. Mine now. He lifted a Springfield rifle from the crate, held it up to the torchlight, and smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. Caleb's hand was on his rifle, ready to take the shot. But Kiona grabbed his arm and shook her head. She pointed to Elijah, who was pulling something from his pack. A cloth bag, heavy, with a long fuse emerging from it. Explosives. The old blacksmith had brought explosives. Elijah held up 5 fingers, then 4, then 3, mouthing the countdown. On 0, he lit the fuse with a match. The wick began to burn, sparking and hissing. He hefted the bag, judged the distance, and threw with surprising strength. The explosive bag arced through the air and landed beneath the crates of rifles. The fuse continued burning. One of Dakota's men saw it and screamed, "Bomb!" Dakota's head snapped toward the sound, saw the burning fuse, understood immediately. "Get it! Put it out!" A man ran toward the explosives. Caleb did not hesitate. He raised the Winchester, sighted quickly, and fired. The man went down 10 feet from the bomb. Chaos erupted. Dakota's men scattered, some running for the side passage, some diving behind the rock formations. Return fire came from multiple directions at once. Bullets sparked off the stone around Caleb's position. He ducked, worked the lever action, came up and fired again. Beside him, Kiona's Colt barked steadily. She was shooting with deadly calm, picking her targets with care despite the chaos. Elijah had reloaded his shotgun and was waiting for anyone who tried to climb to their position. Below, a man ran toward the bomb again, trying to reach it before it exploded. Caleb shot him. He fell 10 feet away, close enough that his body would be caught in the blast. The fuse was burning down. 10 seconds left. 8, 6. Dakota made a decision. He grabbed his Sharps rifle and ran for the side passage, abandoning his men. His survival instinct overrode everything else. 2 of his men followed. The others were caught in confusion, not sure whether to try for the bomb or run. 4 seconds. Caleb grabbed Kiona's arm and Elijah's collar and dragged them back into the tunnel entrance, just as the world became fire. The explosion was massive in the enclosed space. The shockwave hit like a physical blow, a wall of pressure and sound that drove the air from Caleb's lungs. The roar was deafening, overwhelming, a sound so loud it transcended hearing and became something felt in bones and organs. Fire bloomed in the center of the chamber. The explosive bag had been packed with black powder, enough to destroy the rifles but not, Caleb hoped, enough to collapse the entire cave. But he had underestimated. The explosion ignited the ammunition in the Springfield crates, thousands of rounds cooking off in chain reaction, each one adding to the inferno. The cavern became hell. Flames reached toward the ceiling, stalactites shattered from the heat and pressure, raining stone shards like deadly hail. Men caught in the blast simply ceased to exist, vaporized by the force. Others, further away, were torn apart by flying debris or buried under falling rock. The tunnel where Caleb and the others had taken shelter shook violently. Dust and small stones rained down. For a terrifying moment, Caleb thought the whole passage would collapse and bury them alive. But the rock held. The explosion faded to echoes. Then silence. Silence so complete after the cacophony that Caleb's ears rang in the void. He risked a look back into the main chamber. The scene was apocalyptic. Where the crates had stood is now a crater, edges still glowing red-hot. The rifles were gone, utterly destroyed. Bodies or parts of bodies were scattered around the chamber. 3 men, maybe 4, caught too close to escape. The rest had either fled through the side passage or were buried under rockfall. And the secondary effect Caleb had not anticipated. The explosion had blown open the blocked main entrance. The boulder pile that Red Sky had so carefully constructed had been scattered by the blast. The massive cave mouth gaped open to the evening air. "We need to leave," Kiona said, her voice shaky. "Now, before the tunnel collapses." They crawled back the way they had come, moving as fast as they dared. Behind them, the sound of shifting rocks suggested the cave was still settling. Twice during their return journey, the tunnel shook hard enough that they had to stop and wait for it to pass. When they finally emerged into the cold evening air, all 3 of them collapsed on the snow, coughing up rock dust, ears still ringing from the blast. Elijah looked at the others, saw they were alive and unhurt, and began to laugh. Not humor, relief so intense it had to come out somehow. "Did we just blow up a mountain?" "Part of one," Caleb replied, also starting to laugh despite everything. Kiona did not laugh. She was staring back at the cave entrance, visible now as a column of smoke and dust rose from it. "Elijah, where is Elijah?" Caleb's laughter died. He sat up, looking around. "He was right behind us in the tunnel. He must have made it out." But there was no sign of the old blacksmith. "Elijah!" Kiona shouted, stumbling to her feet, a sound from the tunnel entrance. They turned to see a figure emerging, crawling, moving slowly. Not Elijah. Dakota. The Apache warrior pulled himself out of the tunnel, bleeding from a dozen cuts, his clothes singed and torn, but alive. And in his hand, impossibly, he still gripped the Sharp's rifle. He saw them and his face twisted with rage beyond reason. He raised the rifle, sighting on Kiona. Caleb was faster. His Winchester came up, and he fired without conscious thought. The bullet took Dakota in the shoulder, spinning him around. The Sharps fell from his grip. But Dakota was not done. He stumbled to his feet, drew a knife from his belt, and charged. 20 feet, 15, 10. Kiona raised her Colt revolver. For a moment that stretched into eternity, she held him in her sights. Her finger was on the trigger. One squeeze and he would be dead. The man who poisoned her father, who left her to die, who had tried to start a war. Her hand shook. Behind her, Caleb spoke softly. "Kiona, you do not have to become him. You do not have to be that person." Dakota closed to 5 feet, knife raised. Kiona shot him in the wrist. The knife spun away into the snow. Then she lowered the gun. "No," she said, her voice steady now. "Justice is not revenge. Justice is truth. And you will face the truth, Dakota, in front of everyone." Dakota collapsed to his knees, defeated, holding his bleeding wrist. Behind them, sound. Many horses. They turned to see Marshal Hayes riding up with 15 armed men and Red Sky Walker with 10 Cherokee warriors. The old chief had not been idle. He had summoned help while they went into the cave. Hayes dismounted and took in the scene. The smoking cave, the wounded Dakota, the 3 exhausted survivors. "Well," the marshal said, "someone want to tell me what happened here?" Before anyone could answer, movement from the cave. A figure emerged, stumbling, bleeding. Elijah Crow, barely able to walk, but alive. He looked at them and managed a weak smile. "Did we win?" Kiona ran to him, and the old man collapsed into her arms. "Tell Henry," Elijah whispered. "Tell my grandson his grandfather died proud." "No," Kiona said fiercely. "You will tell him yourself. You are not dying today." But Elijah's eyes were closing. The blood loss was too severe. Caleb tore strips from his shirt, trying to staunch the wound in Elijah's chest. But he had seen wounds like this before, had held men while they died from them. Elijah opened his eyes one more time, looked at Kiona, and smiled. "Your father would be proud of you. You became the warrior he hoped you would be. Not a warrior of violence, a warrior of honor." "Please," Kiona begged, "please stay. Tell Henry I love him. Tell him to be good. Tell him to choose kindness over strength. Always." And then Elijah Crow, blacksmith, friend, hero, was gone. For a long moment, no one moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then Kiona let out a sound that was half sob, half scream, and clutched Elijah's body tighter. "No, no, no," she whispered. "Not you too. Not after father. Please, not you too." Caleb knelt beside her, his own throat tight. He had seen death before, too many times. But this one hurt in a way the others had not. Elijah had chosen to come, had chosen to risk everything, and he had paid the price. Red Skywalker approached slowly, removed his hat, and bowed his head. Elijah Crow walked in honor. He will be remembered. Marshal Hayes joined them, his weathered face grave. "I will personally deliver the news to young Henry, and I will make sure the boy knows his grandfather died a hero. Not many men can say that." Kiona looked up, tears streaming down her face. "He saved us. He could have stayed safe in Townsend, but he came anyway, because it was right." "That is what heroes do," Caleb said softly. "They do what is right, even when it costs everything." They wrapped Elijah's body in a blanket and carried him to a sheltered spot away from the cave. Tomorrow they would take him to Little River for a proper burial. Tonight they would honor him by finishing what he started. Kiona held him and wept while the sun set behind the mountains and the stars began to emerge overhead. Caleb stood beside her, one hand on her shoulder, saying nothing because there was nothing to say. Marshal Hayes handcuffed Dakota, read him his charges, and took him into custody. Red Skywalker organized his warriors to search the cave for survivors and casualties. The grim work of accounting began. As darkness fell, they made camp there on the mountainside. Fires were lit, guards were posted, and around one of those fires, Kiona told her story from beginning to end. The poisoning of her father, the false accusation, being left to die, how Caleb had saved her, how Elijah had brought the evidence, how they had destroyed the rifles to prevent war. Red Skywalker listened to every word. So did Marshal Hayes. When she finished, the old chief stood and addressed everyone present. 3 days from now, we will hold council at Little River Camp. Dakota will be tried before the people for murder and treason. The evidence will be presented. Justice will be done. This I promise before the spirits and before these witnesses." And it was done. Not perfectly, not without cost. Elijah was gone. Others had died. But the rifles were destroyed. Dakota was captured, and the truth would be told. That night, Caleb and Kiona sat together away from the fires, looking up at the stars. Neshoba would smile to see this, Caleb said quietly. His daughter, living the peace he fought for. Caleb said again. So would Sarah, Kiona replied. They sat in comfortable silence for a long time. Finally, Caleb spoke. What will you do after the trial? I do not know. Little River does not feel like home anymore. Too many painful memories. I thought perhaps I would travel for a while, see other places, find where I belong. Or, Caleb said carefully, you could stay at the cabin. It is lonely there, could use another person, someone who knows how to survive, how to fight when fighting is needed, how to find peace when peace is possible. Kiona looked at him. Are you asking me to stay with you? Yes, not as a guest, as family. The family we choose, not the family we are born into. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled. My father used to say that family is not blood. Family is promise. Do you promise, Caleb, to stand with me, to build something better than what we lost? I promise to protect you, to stand with you, to help you heal, As you have helped me heal, then I accept. When this is done, we go home. Together. They shook hands, sealing the promise, and sat together under the stars until dawn came and brought with it the new day. The trial 3 days later was brief and conclusive. The evidence was overwhelming. The vial of arsenic, Elijah's written testimony, the testimony of witnesses who had seen Dakota's plotting. Marshall Hayes formally charged him under federal law. Red Skywalker formally exiled him from the tribe forever. Dakota was sentenced to exile in the Cursed Mountains, 40 miles south, to live alone until he died. And after that exile, 20 years in federal prison. He was led away in chains, broken and defeated, and no one mourned. 6 months later, on a warm August day, Caleb and Kiona stood on the porch of the rebuilt cabin in Cades Cove. It was larger now, with 2 rooms and real glass windows and a garden where Kiona grew her healing herbs using Apache knowledge passed down through generations. Inside the cabin, hanging on the wall, were 2 photographs. Sarah, smiling in her moment of frozen time, and Neshoba, in a picture Kiona had recovered from Little River, looking stern but with kindness in his eyes. Below them hung the Sharp's rifle, empty now, never to be fired again but preserved as memorial and reminder. In the clearing in front of the cabin, 5 children ranging from 6 to 12 years old practiced archery under Kiona's instruction. One of them was Henry Crow, Elijah's grandson, now living with them and learning the skills his grandfather wanted him to have. Caleb emerged from his workshop carrying a rocking chair he had just finished. He set it on the porch next to the one already there and sat down, watching Kiona work with the children. She finished the lesson and walked over, sitting in the chair beside him. They rocked in companionable silence while the sun set over the Great Smoky Mountains and painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. "Do you think your father would approve?" Caleb asked. "You living here with me, teaching children, building instead of fighting?" "I think he would say I am finally understanding what he tried to teach me, that the greatest strength is choosing peace when you have the power to choose war." "And Sarah, do you think she would approve?" Kiona took his hand. "I think she would say, you have finally forgiven yourself." And that is all she ever wanted. They sat together as darkness fell and the first stars appeared. Inside the cabin, Henry was setting the table for dinner. In the stable, their horses were bedded down for the night. All around them, the mountains stood eternal and watchful. "There are promises made in darkness," Caleb said softly. "Promises only the mountains hear. I promised to save you, and you saved me. Not from death, from being alone, from forgetting how to hope." "Then we saved each other," Kiona replied, "and that is the best kind of promise to keep." They rocked on the porch as night came fully down, 2 people who had lost everything and found each other in the ruins. 2 people who had chosen, against all odds and all reason, to build something new from the ashes of what was lost. The mountain held their promise in its ancient stone. The wind carried their names into the high country, and in a small cabin in Cades Cove, Tennessee, 2 survivors proved that sometimes the greatest victories are not won in battle, but in the simple choice to keep living, keep hoping, keep believing that tomorrow can be better than yesterday. Dedicated to those who keep promises in the darkness. Dedicated to those who choose honor over revenge. Dedicated to those who understand that family is not blood, but choice. Not heritage, but promise. In memory of Elijah Crow, 1816 to 1878, who chose redemption over silence, and in doing so became a hero. In memory of Neshoba, 1828 to 1878, who taught his daughter that wisdom is greater than violence, and honor more valuable than victory. They live on in the stories we tell and the promises we keep.